Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who read The Name of the Rose and said, yeah, but what if we made it hornier and stupider? Each month we spin the wheel and land on a new genre, and right now we are reading historical fiction novels, including this one, Baudolino by Umberto Eco. I'm Zach, and this week I'm really interested in talking about the differing reading experiences that this book might offer in a pre-Google universe and a post-Google universe.
Oh, so interesting. I'm Bob. I'm interested in what happens when you have a liar constructing history. We have not just a unreliable narrator in Baudolino. He is lying, telling us he's lying, and then the interlocutor, Nicetas, the guy who's listening to him, his life story, keeps telling us, the readers, oh, I know Baudolino is lying again.
Yeah, not just lying. He also tells us he has a faulty memory. He says, now I might have a story of my own, though I've lost everything I had written down about my past. And what's more, when I try to recall it, my thoughts become all confused. It's not that I don't remember the facts, but I'm not able to give them a meaning. So the man can't think, and we're constantly being told that, wait a minute, like the historian who is listening to this knows that certain things that Baudolino is telling us happened actually in a different order in the historical record. But then, while he's talking, he keeps saying that he would glance furtively at his interlocutor as if warning him not to take him seriously. So not only can he not remember, but he's also like winking and being like, yeah, I'm lying to you.
What do you think about that? Since this is our final book in historical fiction, we've read Remains of the Day, we read A Rising Man, and we read Power and the Glory by Graham Greene. And those felt like they were fairly faithful to history. This feels like Baudolino is saying whatever he wants. We even end up, this is a crazy story. I mean, it's a bunch of wild and crazy guys. They go off on an adventure for someone who doesn't exist, and then they end up in a land of fairy tale medieval monsters. But what do you think about us as readers of historical fiction and kind of being thrown into medieval history, but it's all out of whack? It's completely not just out of context. It's being whipped around like crazy.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And I guess just as a point of comparison, I would probably take the book that sticks closest to the history, which is probably Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. I mean, he wrote that just a few years after the events that he's describing are taking place. Even if the characters are made up, he went to Mexico and he's supposedly describing what he saw, or at least that's kind of injected into the narrative. Now, a lot of people who talk about the way that historical fiction should be written mention this idea that, it should be at least 50 years in the past. A good amount of time needs to have happened. And yet what we have here is a story that takes place 1,000 years in the past. Like, it would be almost impossible for it to stick close to the truth. And I think that part of the message he wants to give us is, why even try? Why even bother?
Do you think that is is that a dangerous thing to do to history, though? I want to look at two examples. There's two TV shows, Downton Abbey and then Bridgerton. Bridgerton comes out, I think, 2020, and Downton Abbey's like 2010. But they're both period pieces. They're both about really upper-class British people who have these gigantic households and all of the goings-on there. But when you go and you look at the costumes, Downton Abbey, whenever they do interviews about the costumes, it's all about how accurate it was and how many historical accounts they got. They even have historians on the show to point out if there are any problems with the costumes. But then I watched an interview with the people who did the Bridgerton costumes, and here's some quotes from their interview. The head costume designer says, "This is not a history lesson. This is about glamour." And then he says, "Yeah, we knew it was 1813, but there would be no women's bonnets. And then we were mostly inspired by Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Marilyn Monroe, and Jessica Rabbit." And they said that they are...
Jessica Rabbit.
They said that we're just making the silhouettes of history, but we don't use any period colors or period fabrics. And they even used 3D printed fabric. And I thought that was absolutely nuts. Bridgerton gets criticized a lot, but I know that it's beloved. People like it a lot. But I'm just really curious about, that idea sounded kind of fun to me. Use whatever and make it look like 1813. But maybe it's a slap in the face of history and historians. Do you think, though, Baudolino, is it in the Bridgerton camp with 3D printed fabric, or is it in the Downton Abbey camp, or is it something completely different?
Perhaps controversially, I think it's in the Downton Abbey camp. I don't know how much time you spent like following up on the references in this book, but this book sticks pretty close to medieval history. I mean, and by that I mean many of the events that happen here. So like, to give you an example, canonizing Charlemagne for Frederick's political gain, or the youths who are taken to the compound and drugged with hashish. That comes from history books. The hashash, what are they called? The hashashins, which brings us our word today for assassin.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah, like, and Frederick drowning in the river. Like, what he's done with this book is essentially do Forrest Gump, where it's like, I'm going to take you through the history of this time, but I'm going to have an idiot be at the center of everything. And like, the official story of how things happened actually isn't the way that it happened. It still looks the way that it happened, but he didn't actually drown in the river. He died, in the bedroom, and then they threw him in the river to make it look like he drowned. Like, it's history, but with a really fun spin. And I think that, a lot of people criticize this for being like, oh, well, it dives into fantasy. There's unicorns. But in a sense, I feel like it's more true to history, because you read medieval history books, or you read, history books from antiquity. They are full of these creatures. You know what I mean? These are the creatures that people actually, I don't want to say they believe they existed, but they're certainly in the popular discourse. It's not like he's just making this up and sending him to a fantasy land. He's pulling these references from all of these places.
I mean, even Marco Polo ran into monsters and describes different monsters that he ran into, and we know that they can't be real now. And it really made me think of Herodotus, the histories, where we have the first historian, the first history book, but then there are all of these fantastical elements because he's going to these places and either hearing eyewitness accounts or experiencing things himself. But this book really reminded me of that. And here's just one little passage that I think really feels like Herodotus. When he's going to, when he's describing all of his journeys, Baudolino kind of tells us about these different cultures and different scenes that he sees. But he says, he wrote of the land where honey trees and flower trees grow, of Mount Ararat, from whose peak on clear days you can glimpse the remains of Noah's Ark, and those who have scaled it say they touch with their finger the hole through which the devil escaped when Noah recited the Benedict. So it feels very much like the original intent and goal of history, where Herodotus was just, he's just going around asking for historical tales, but it's also a little bit more like Power and the Glory, where Herodotus is just doing like a travelogue. It's a mix. And here we have Baudolino, Eco positioning him as a historian, reflecting back on his travels. It feels like Eco is not even doing history here, but Baudolino is doing history here.
Well, and we also, we're also at a remove from this, because it's not Baudolino directly that seems to be telling us.
Right.
I get the sense that we're being filtered through, what's his name? Nicetas, yeah.
Oh, the Greek.
Nicetas, yeah. Who is basically the primary historian of Constantinople at that time. He's the Herodotus of that time. So you get the sense that like, he's almost making a comment here about like the kind of people who someone like Herodotus or Nicetas was talking to in order to get all of these tales of, salamanders, which are snakes with legs, but they live in fire, like the idea being that many of these historians, like obviously Herodotus didn't travel as far east as he says he did, but he presumably talked to people who said they did. And these are the kind of people who he presumably talked to, just inveterate liars, scoundrels even.
So these scoundrels and liars telling us history, and then we make it our history, we put it into books because that's all we can get access to. Eco, in an interview with Medium, he says that, and I thought this was very interesting about how Baudolino's kind of inventing, because it's not always, well, we can't really even tell if it's him mistaking things or just inventing things to entertain Nicetas. But he says, Eco says, Baudolino's stories begin as his own inventions, but they become true. I wanted to celebrate the great function of every narrator to tell something that didn't exist before the telling. And it's just interesting to have him as our lens into medieval history. And like you said, he's going through was going to say going through the motions, but he's not. He's going through history, telling us a little bit about it. But then all of this crazy extra stuff is happening. And he tells us too, when I was a boy, I started to tell lies, and I found that people just believed them because my lies became true. And Nicasis says, well, didn't that make you want to tell fewer lies? He said, no. I realized I was so far into the lie, I just had to keep going.
And that's part of like the joy of the story, right? Like the way that the narrative shifts on a whim just because Baudolino says it does. Like someone says, well, you idiot, the Grail wouldn't have been covered in jewels. Jesus was a carpenter's son. He would, it would have been a simple wooden one.
Be a root.
And he looks down into, he looks down at his father's bowl, which is a simple wooden one. And he's like, well, this could be the Holy Grail. And then suddenly his father's cup is the Holy Grail. And the story just moves on from there with his father's cup being the actual relic. Or the fabrication of relics wholesale. We got 10 heads of John the Baptist here. Stuff like that is so fun.
What do you think? I was wondering, like, what kind of story is this? They're going on a journey and they're going to find Prester John. Now, Prester John is a real historical thing. I mean, he's not a real person, but he's a historical event that, affected things for 400, 500 years. But in this story, Baudolino and his friends decide, okay, the only way we can get to where we want to in life is if we go and find Prester John and prove that he exists. Baudolino writes a letter. There were 4 popes, as far as we know, who wrote letters, and we have access to those letters. But I was wondering, what kind of story is this where they are going on a journey? Does it feel more to you like the Odyssey, where it's an adventure and you're trying to survive? Is it more a picaresque, like Pinocchio, where just crazy things are happening? Or does it feel more like a journey to the West, where we're trying to carry something very important from point A to point B?
Ooh, yeah, great comparison points. I will say, in terms of like picaresque, it does something which I think a lot of picaresques do, which is each chapter kind of really just tells you what it's doing. Like chapter 32, Baudolino sees a lady with a unicorn. Chapter 26, Baudolino and the Journey of the Magi. Chapter 21, Baudolino and the Sweets of Byzantium. There's that kind of episodic structure where nothing too big happens in each chapter. And yet it's always this kind of like unique, weird little run that happens per chapter. And I think that's very picaresque. This constant stream of marvels that keeps on coming one chapter after another. But I also think comparing it to the Odyssey is a really good comparison as well, because like the Odyssey, it's basically explaining things. It's explaining the way the world worked or works, and gives us a geographic layout. It tells us about the world. So I hate to say yes to all, but I might have to say yes to all.
It's even more intense than a yes and. Yes to all. And, what do you think? When we read A Rising Man by Abir Mukherjee, we both liked it in ways, but then you had a good criticism of it that I thought was very interesting, where he said, I don't really like how he's just teaching me how to... So he's teaching us what happened, but then he's also kind of telling us how to think about it. And that's what you didn't like. It's like the author is telling you how to think about history and telling you exactly what your alignment with it should be. But this seems like all bets are off. I was wondering, did you enjoy this experience more, where there seems to be almost no alignment? There are sacred things, but it feels like nothing is really held sacred. And it is, I don't know what I'm supposed to really think after this. I just had a great journey.
Yeah. Well, okay. So my issue with Abir Mukherjee's A Rising Man was that what you essentially have is a retrospective look upon the time period. So we are going to talk about the Indian Raj, and we're going to do it through the perspective of a British police officer character who's trying to solve a murder in this time. So it's a historical fiction novel, but the protagonist character is essentially going to have all of the right 2025 opinions. He's going to be an immensely lovable character because despite being an agent of repression in that colonialist enterprise, he's actually just a really good guy. You know what I mean? Who disagrees with everything that's going on there, even if he doesn't do anything to stop it. So it feels like a fundamentally false situation, an artifice that's being put up so that it can teach us about the British Raj at that time. Now, I say that as a point of contrast because in this book, we are also being placed in, we're being placed in Constantinople in the Middle Ages, but Baudolino is not a character who I fundamentally feel like I have anything in common with. He doesn't feel like he has a 2025 brain. And the lesson about history isn't, oh, Frederick Barbarossa bad, or, oh, Constantinople bad, or, oh, pillaging bad. Any of those things could be true, but it's not the point of the book. The point of the book seems to be much more, not question history, but just recognize and view with suspicion the idea of like written sources, especially from so long ago, and the origin of these texts and how they're created and generated, and how it might cast into suspicion everything we supposedly know about the past.
But Baudolino is absolutely insane. So my question for you, like, how do we trust this totally insane? Well, he's not maybe insane, but he goes insane. He ends up on top of a huge pole and just goes up there to die for many days at a time. I feel like it's hard to trust him, as we know, because he's a liar. He's a lovable liar. But also, he seems to have totally lost his mind by the time of telling the story anyway. I felt a lot like, and I've got a question, do you think this might be weird fiction? But it reminded me a lot of The Willows by Algernon Blackwood, where the Swede and the other character are trying not to let their subjective mind inform them too much about what's happening outside. So they're trying to avoid too much blending between subjectivity and objectivity. Otherwise, they'll go insane and they will let this creature from the fourth dimension come out and kill them because it's attracted to you being afraid of it. What do you think of Baudolino kind of being unable to separate subjectivity and objectivity? He's this character who lies, and those lies become true, or at least they become our history, and they become the truth that we know about everything that was happening to him. Does this feel dangerous? Not just we can't trust him, but does it feel dangerous to have this kind of subjective, objective lack of filter?
I want to respond to the first part of your question really quick before I get to the second, which is that moment of him on the tower, where he becomes a mystic. For me, I looked at that and I didn't see it as weird so much as almost like a Joseph Campbell-esque hero's journey thing, where, finally by the end of the book, he becomes the sage. You know what I mean? You can even say this in like Forrest Gump. Like he's at the point where he runs across the coast to the other side of the United States. And by the end of it, he has a big, long white beard. It's his moment of becoming wise. But the book can't do it sincerely. You know what I mean? Like he becomes wise and he says these sentences and gives guidance. But then, like, as soon as people get mad at him and, he comes off the thing and he's like, they stoned me. They threw rocks at me. And he, he stops being the wise man. The book is like aware of the formulas for this kind of thing, aware of the formulas, but always willing to subvert them in really fun and interesting ways.
But what about his insanity, Zach? I know we can't take it seriously. He's the sage up on the pole, but he seems to go nuts. And I think that there's a lot at stake for us as readers of historical fiction here, because if he's going to tell us a historical fiction tale, if he's gone insane, what does that do to our understanding of history? I know we've talked about this a little bit, but this filter between this subjective and objective, as far as him inventing history, not just, oh, he's a liar, but also, is he a dangerous liar?
Are the ravings of a madman different than the fantasies of a sane man? I'm not sure. But it is fun, that's all I have to say. It is fun. It does make me wonder exactly, I should have been paying closer attention to I don't want to say the chronology, but like, what was the state of Baudolino at the different points of the story that he was telling to Nicetas? And how does that affect what's being said?
I think you're right. Baudolino is going through so many different transformations, and it's almost like the story is going through different genres too. And in these changes, is it changing the way that we see history? The genre change. Does that change now the not narration, but the explanation of history, and then also the change in Baudolino. Does that change our what we get, what he delivers to us? There is a scene in the middle where he's falling in love. We find out. Actually, I won't spoil that. That's a great surprise. He falls in love with this Hypatia who's in the forest, and he starts talking to her. What is your name? I don't have a name. I'm a Hypatia. Well, what do your friends call you? They call me Hypatia. But what are their names? They're all Hypatia. And he develops this relationship. His heart gets broken at one point, many points, and then he becomes a sage eventually. So it's interesting to have this novel continuously evolving, genre to genre, have the character change, and then also have that be a new, like changing eyeglass lenses. Like you keep changing your prescription, and that is our lens, which through which we see this history.
I'm glad you mentioned the genre changes, because what did you think of it when it suddenly turned into a locked room mystery?
Yeah, that was a shock. But then I went back to the beginning, and it starts out as a locked room mystery, just in a very subtle, weird way. And I was just shocked that he brought it back to that. This mystery is strange because Baudolino tells Nicetas, look, I got to tell you a story. I did something really terrible. I killed somebody, and it was for revenge for the death of my father. Now I'm going to tell you the whole story that brought me there. And then it just suddenly comes back at the very end. And then Nicetas says, no, you're wrong. You've thought about this the complete wrong way. You are your father's killer. That was so strange, but it felt like it was a throwback to when we read Name of the Rose, which is, it's not exactly, I guess that is also kind of a locked room mystery, but
I'd call it a Holmesian, a Sherlock Holmesian parody. I mean, it is a total parody of Arthur Conan Doyle, and maybe a little bit of Agatha Christie, with the way that more and more people just keep dying as they go.
Yeah. I mean, in this journey, so many people die too. What do you think, though, for people reading this? Because we just talked about different genres. Do you feel like, I don't know much about medieval history. I've just looked at a lot of the weird pictures of the weird monsters, but do you think someone who's maybe not interested in history, who would you recommend could read this book? Because it is a big ask. It's a big book, and it's a strange book.
Well, I think that this kind of goes back to what I started off by saying, by reading this pre-Google and post-Google, because it was really interesting going back and reading reviews from major literary magazines, New York Times, The New Yorker, Atlantic. Like at the time that this was published, a lot of people were just like, really ambivalent about this book. I thought maybe a little too ambivalent. And they were just kind of like their big focus, I think, was that to them, it felt like the narrative was slack. So they said, the guy wrote Name of the Rose 2 books ago, and he's not giving us what we want, which is a formally tight mystery. Right. What he's given us is just all of the details in a great landslide, an avalanche of trivia. But what a lot of people said was the interesting part of this book was that they couldn't tell how much was being invented by Eco, how much was being invented by Baudolino, and how much was real, which was such a strange thing for me to read, because any time in this book that I found something interesting, I would just open up ChatGPT and be like, hey, look online and tell me what's up with this, And like what that, I mean, being an internet empowered reader who's reading this, God knows how many decades after the book was published, it's a totally different experience, because you can see the ways in which it was constructed. You can see the ways in which it's referencing all of these different things, or who these characters are supposed to be, or how they are parroting the official, not parroting like the bird, but parodying like the, I don't know, the style, like official historical
the parody
accounts.
Bird. Oh.
Yes. And to me, the great enthusiasm I feel for this book probably stems from the fact that I can see how it was made, see how much like effort and I don't want to say the energy justifies it, but it's not even trying to be a tight mystery or a tight travel log or a tight buildings Roman or anything. It's just trying to be, like you said, the Odyssey. Like, we're going to give you a bunch of chapters, we're going to give you a picaresque, and we are just going to relentlessly spoof history.
And I wonder if that would change how it was received too if it came out now, while we have access to all of these things, where it makes it very easy to go and check. Okay, is this magical creature a real historical magical creature that people wrote about and invented? Is this weird ruse to get so many of John Baptist's head in one place? How do you double a head? But anyway, how do you get all of these historical things verified? You have to be a medieval scholar yourself, and that readership is quite small. But now you can go and verify these things for yourself if you're interested in them, or you can just keep going and just treat it almost like a history-inspired fantasy. I know it's not really a fantasy, but it does flow as smoothly and as fun as other fantasy books. And I think it's a shame that it would get left behind and considered, too dense or too steeped with history, because it's nuts. It's very fun. It's just an insane book. I mean, we have magical creatures, we have wars, we have like weird Ocean's 11 plots. It is great, and I think a lot more people should be reading Baudolino. The Name of the Rose is great too, but Baudolino, I don't hear anyone ever talk about it.
Yeah, for me, it's really cemented the idea that Umberto Eco is, I don't want to say the king, but, he can do no wrong. There's a few authors where I think we both kind of agree they can do no wrong. Philip K. Dick being one of them. Maybe Robert E. Howard, but Umberto Eco is really, really interesting. One thing that I think we haven't mentioned is that in addition to him taking from all of these ancient sources, the debates of the vacuum, or, having the different people represent different, schismatics in the Christian church, their ideas about the church. He will also throw in some modern sources as well. So like in The Name of the Rose, he actually had paragraphs that were rewritten from Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet. Like he would just take the paragraphs and then rewrite them in a medieval setting. Just copy, paste, swap out some words. In this one, like, I think it was the conversation with the pygmies in it. And he has them speaking a strange language that is one of the few languages that Baudolino doesn't understand. He's just copying and pasting the language from Gulliver's Travel, the Lilliputians. There's a lot of really fun and interesting like Easter eggs in this that I'm tickled. Bob.
What's really interesting about that Lilliputian passage too is I saw a lecture that not Baudolino did, a lecture that Eco did, and he was talking about the different translations of this book and all of the problems. I thought this was great, of cursing and being really creative with bad, offensive words. And he said that when he was going from Italian to English to German to French to all of these different languages, he had to work with the translator and think, okay, if we want something that feels really old, what is the appropriate language that will give the right response we're going for in the reader? And they couldn't just go back and use like Middle English or something like that if it's going from Italian to Middle Italian, because maybe Italians would be familiar with Middle Italian, but if you give us Middle English, we'll have no idea what we're doing. So they had to be really deliberate about where they got their source material for style and getting these things across. And then he talked about like all of these creative ways of cursing. It had to be completely different in each language. He said necessarily so, even though you lose some of the jokes, you just can't recreate the same words with the same feeling, especially for bad words. I thought that was a great thing to lecture about.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I guess the question that's, right in the forefront of my mind right now is, how can we read more Umberto Eco? Like how do we slot this in with our, our genre spinning quest here? How can it fit in on the wheel?
I think we can be really creative with our putting this on the wheel, because we've seen so many genres in this book already, and it's really hard to define by itself. We just say it's a picaresque, but really, who knows what this is, whether it's really historical fiction. We've already talked about that. But I think any of Eco's books, they seem to grapple with so many genres and what it means to do a certain genre. Like, can you really have not a police procedural, but a consulting detective like Sherlock Holmes set in the Middle Ages? Can you really have a picaresque with Baudolino, can you really have a historical fiction where all of it is a lie? I think any of his books will be able to fit in on the wheel. I wanted to see what you thought about, because comparing this with our first book, Remains of the Day, as far as our first book of this historical fiction series, we noticed that Stevens is really disinterested in history. He is the butler in Remains of the Day. He is enthusiastic about his master being a big deal in history, but then he doesn't seem to want to get involved. He doesn't want to know what's happening. And when we looked at what Ishiguro said about his own book, he said, look, I'm more interested in the trope of the butler and our contemporary understanding of the classic English butler. And he wanted to think about, like, how are we all our own classic English butlers? How are we repressed in different ways? And I was wondering, that is using history as a tool to create character, or as kind of window dressing because it's appropriate to that time. And you use it as something behind the curtain, and it's behind the curtain, behind the Iron Curtain, and then it shows that the character cannot really engage in history in a proper way. I was wondering, is this the opposite? Is Baudolino the complete opposite, where Eco wants to use a character and our understanding of character development, or our understanding of narration? You know, they at least should tell us some truths, but then betraying that sense and then giving us history through that betrayed sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's funny, mentioning Stevens, like, we have such a clear idea of who that individual is in the face of history. But I actually can't tell you who Baudolino is. I can tell you he's a liar, but that's like a negative statement. You know what I mean? Like saying that someone is a liar about who they are and, what they've done is not a positive statement about anything substantive about them. It's just a casting doubt on everything they say. So we don't really seem to have any sense of who the individual is, but we got a great sense of the history.
Yeah, total flip.
Or maybe like what it feels like to live in that history. I think you had just said something about Stevens not wanting or not being really an active participant in his history. Baudolino is kind of the opposite. He is such an active participant in the history that you can't separate him at all from any historical event that has happened here.
Reminds me of the Churchill quote, "History shall be good to me, for I intend to write it." Baudolino has done the same thing here. Yeah.
Except maybe his is more for I intend to invent it.
Yeah. Elaborately for thousands of pages.
Yep. Well, we had a good run with historical fiction. I would gladly do it again. I had a blast. Some of the books we read were absolutely awesome, especially this one. But next time we have science fiction. So we got a little bit of fun things to look forward to, I think.
Going away from history and straight into the future.
That's right. Talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.